In Cold Spring, Colorado, 1897, a telegraph operator was about to witness something that would shatter her town's carefully maintained silence. What started as watching a routine tax auction took a shocking turn when a blacklisted surveyor bought a worthless collapsed tunnel for $80, and the town's most powerful banker didn't try to stop him. Ruth Calder wasn't your typical small-town telegraph operator. For years, she had spent her life mapping injustices in a private notebook, watching wages disappear into scrip and debt, while men like Ephraim Pike built empires on paper theft. She was known for noticing what others missed, the warm rivets that shouldn't be warm, the echoes that came back wrong. The moment a lawyer stopped bidding, when she and Silas Reed discovered a brass acoustic lock hiding a sealed refuge chamber, they had no idea they were uncovering proof of systematic wage theft against a multiracial cooperative of 43 workers who'd been cheated out of nearly $5,000. Ruth made a choice that would lead to federal warrants, a trestle standoff, and the dismantling of Pike's kingdom built on silence. What began as curiosity about a humming tunnel would become a town-wide uprising. Cold Spring would never be the same after Ruth stood on a hillside and read 43 names aloud, and every stolen wage was finally answered with, "Here." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should have known the tunnel wasn't worthless the moment Ephraim Pike's lawyer stopped bidding. Auction took place on a Tuesday morning in March, when the ground was still half frozen and the air tasted of coal smoke and last night's snow. I'd walked down from the telegraph office on my lunch break, curious about what the county would do with a collapsed rail tunnel nobody had touched in 3 years. The auctioneer stood on a crate outside the land office, his breath making small clouds as he called for opening bids. "Tunnel Section 14, Cold Spring Spur Line," he announced. "Approximately 200 linear feet, granite and timber construction. Collapsed in the winter of '94, sold as is, no warranty of salvage value." The crowd was thin. Most folks had better things to do than bid on a hole in the ground. I recognized the usual speculators, the ones who showed up to every tax sale hoping for overlooked value. And I recognized Pike's attorney, a man named Garrett who wore suits too fine for our altitude and smiled like he was doing you a favor by taking your money. A stranger stood near the back, tall, maybe 35, with a surveyor's case slung over one shoulder and the careful posture of someone who'd spent years looking at grades and calculating loads. He had the sort of face you'd pass in a crowd without noticing, except for his eyes. They moved like a draftsman's pencil, measuring everything. "Opening bid, $50, the auctioneer called. Garrett raised his hand immediately. "50! The stranger waited 3 beats, then 60. I pulled my notebook from my coat pocket and made a small mark. Not that anyone had hired me to watch this auction, but I'd learned long ago that the things people wanted were often more interesting than the things they said they wanted. 70, Garrett counted. 80, the stranger said, his voice flat as a ruled line. Garrett glanced back toward the land office, where Pike himself stood in the doorway watching. Pike was a compact man with silver hair and the kind of patient stillness that made people nervous. He'd made his fortune bundling mine scrip and bad debt, then buying up the county piece by piece when men couldn't pay. Half the shops on Front Street paid rent to one of his holding companies. Pike gave Garrett the smallest shake of his head. Garrett lowered his hand. "We're out." The auctioneer looked surprised. "Going once at $80, twice. Anyone else?" Silence. "Sold to bidder 12 for $80. The stranger stepped forward to claim his deed. As he passed me, I caught the scent of machine oil and graphite. Engineers' hands, calloused in the right places. I should have left then. I should have walked back up the hill to my telegraph key and the afternoon dispatches. Instead, I waited until the crowd dispersed, then walked the half-mile out to the tunnel mouth. The approach was overgrown with scrub willow and wild rose. Someone had strung a rope across the entrance years ago with a faded warning sign. "Unsafe structure, keep out." I ducked under the rope and stood at the threshold where daylight gave way to shadow. The tunnel exhaled cold air that tasted of stone and something else. Something that made the small hairs on my neck stand up. I pulled a loose rock from the debris pile and tossed it into the dark. It clattered once, twice, then stopped. No echo. Or rather, the echo came back wrong. Muffled, swallowed, I stepped closer, letting my eyes adjust. The timbers framing the entrance were intact, massive beams that should have rotted by now but hadn't. The wood looked oiled, preserved. Someone had cared for this tunnel long after the railroad abandoned it. 30 feet in, where the daylight thinned to grey, I found the first anomaly. A row of rivets set into the granite arch above the keystone. They were too neat, too decorative for structural work. And when I reached up to touch them, they were warm, not hot. Just warm enough to notice on a morning when everything else was cold. I pulled off my glove and pressed my palm flat against the rock. Somewhere deep inside the mountain, something hummed. Not loudly, barely audible, but steady as a pulse. Unusual, isn't it? I spun around. The stranger from the auction stood at the tunnel mouth, silhouetted against the morning light. The echo, he continued, stepping inside. It doesn't carry the way it should. The timbers are absorbing sound in a pattern that makes no engineering sense. I studied him for a moment, then decided on honesty. The rivets are warm. He moved closer, setting down his surveyor's case. "Show me," I pointed. He reached up, pressed his own hand to the metal and went very still. "My name is Silas Reed," he said quietly. "I'm a surveyor, or I was before the railroad blacklisted me for refusing to falsify grade reports on a bond issue. Ruth Calder. Telegraph operator and occasional mapmaker. Why are you here, Miss Calder?" "Curiosity. And because Ephraim Pike's lawyer stopped bidding the moment you hit $80. If Pike wanted you to have this tunnel, that means he thinks it's worthless. Which means it probably isn't." Silas Reed smiled, just barely. "I bought it because 3 years ago I helped survey this line. The crew boss reported the tunnel collapsed due to settling. But I reviewed the original plans last week at the territorial office. This tunnel was over-engineered, triple the standard timber bracing. Ventilation shafts that don't appear on the railroad's final maps. Someone built this to last, then claimed it failed." "Someone," I said. "You mean Pike?" "Pike owned the bonds on this spur line. When the tunnel collapsed, he collected insurance and sold the salvage rights. Then bought the whole section at tax auction 3 years later for pennies." I pulled out my notebook and sketched the rivet pattern, noting the warmth. "If the tunnel's not actually collapsed, what's inside?" "That," Silas said, "is what I intend to find out." Footsteps on gravel made us both turn. Ephraim Pike himself stood at the tunnel mouth, flanked by 2 men I recognized as county wardens. He wore a wool coat that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, and he carried a silver-topped walking stick he didn't need. "Mr. Reed," Pike said pleasantly, "congratulations on your purchase. I hope you'll allow me to inspect the property." "As a concerned citizen, of course. These old tunnels can be dangerous." "The deed's recorded," Silas replied. "The property is mine, and I don't require assistance." Pike's smile didn't waver. "Of course. Though I should mention that the county has certain safety ordinances. Abandoned structures that pose a hazard can be condemned and sealed. For the public good. I'll keep that in mind." Pike tapped his walking stick against the rock, once, twice. The sound echoed wrong, swallowed by the tunnel, the same way my thrown stone had been. He noticed me then. "Miss Calder, I didn't expect to see you here. I'm mapping," I said, holding up my notebook. "The telegraph company wants updated surveys of all the spur lines." It was a lie, but a plausible one. Pike studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Do give my regards to your supervisor." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Mr. Reed. Do be careful." Cave-ins can happen so suddenly. He walked away, his wardens following. But I noticed they didn't go far. Just far enough to watch from the scrub willow. Silas waited until they were out of earshot. "You're not mapping for the telegraph company?" "No. Then why lie?" Because Pike just threatened to seal this tunnel, and I want to know what he's afraid we'll find before he gets the chance." Silas considered this. "Tomorrow morning, then, before dawn. Bring a lantern if you have one. And Miss Calder, yes, bring something to mark distances. I suspect we're going to need a very accurate map." I arrived at the tunnel mouth an hour before sunrise, carrying Tamsin O'Rourke's lunch pail and a collapsible birdcage that weighed almost nothing. Inside the cage, Duke the Canary huddled on his perch, a tiny yellow sentinel who'd saved Tamsin's life once when a gas leak crept through the boarding house cellar. She'd insisted I take him. "Miners used to carry them into the deep shafts," she'd said, latching the cage. "If Duke stops singing, you get yourself out. Understand?" I understood. The morning was cold enough to hurt. My breath made ghosts in the lantern light as I ducked under the warning rope and stepped into the tunnel's mouth. Duke chirped once, testing the air. When he didn't fall silent, I moved deeper. The chalk marks appeared 30 feet in, where the daylight faded to permanent dusk. Someone had drawn symbols on the rock face. Not words, but patterns, loops and lines that might have been decorative if they weren't so precise. I traced one with my finger and felt the faintest groove, as if the mark had been cut into the stone and then filled with chalk dust. "You're early." I turned. Silas Reed stood behind me, carrying a tool satchel and a pocket lantern. He'd dressed for work, canvas trousers, heavy boots, a leather apron over his shirt. "I wanted to test the air," I said, gesturing to Duke. Silas nodded approval. "Sensible." He set down his satchel and pulled out a small hammer and chisel. "I brought tools for the rivets. If they're conducting heat, they might be concealing something." We worked in silence for a while. Silas tapped at the warm rivets, listening to the way sound traveled through metal and stone. I sketched the chalk marks, noting their positions relative to the rivet pattern. The two seemed related. The loops in the chalk aligned with certain rivets, creating a rhythm. "These aren't random," I said. "The chalk marks. Or the rivets." I held up my notebook, where I'd drawn both patterns overlapping. "Look, 3 loops, then 5, then 2. The rivets follow the same count. 3 warm, 5 cold, 2 warm." Silas studied my sketch. "A sequence, or a code." He moved deeper into the tunnel, testing the walls with his hammer. I followed with Duke's cage in one hand and my lantern in the other. 50 feet in, we found the brass plate. It was set into the rock face at shoulder height, nearly hidden under a century of soot and spider webs. I wouldn't have noticed it, except that Silas's hammer made a different sound when he tapped near it. A ringing tone instead of a dull thud. "There," I said. We scraped away the soot. The brass plate was circular, maybe 8 inches across, with a design etched into its surface. Not decorative scrollwork, but something functional. A series of concentric rings, each divided into segments. And at the center, a small brass lever that didn't move when Silas tried to turn it. "It's locked," he said, "or it requires a key we haven't found yet." I leaned closer, studying the rings. They reminded me of something. Train schedules. The way the telegraph company printed departure times in circular diagrams, each ring representing a different line. "Silas, do you have a whistle?" He reached into his coat and produced a brass pocket whistle, the kind railroad men used for signals. "Why, the chalk marks. The rivet pattern, 352. What if it's not a numeric code? What if it's intervals? 3 whistle blasts, then 5, then 2. You think this plate responds to sound? I think someone built an acoustic lock. And I think the morning train schedule might be the key." Silas looked at me for a long moment. Then he smiled, genuine and bright in the lantern light. "Miss Calder, you have a remarkable mind." He raised the whistle to his lips. 3 short blasts. 5 longer ones. 2 short, the brass plate vibrated under my hand. Not much, just enough to feel. And then, with a grinding sound that made Duke flutter his wings, the lever at the center rotated clockwise. One of the concentric rings loosened. Behind it I saw the edge of something steel. "Again," I whispered. Silas repeated the pattern. Another ring shifted. The steel edge widened into a seam. We were so focused on the plate that we almost missed the sound of boots on gravel outside. "Lanterns out," Silas hissed. We killed the light and pressed back against the tunnel wall. Duke went silent in his cage, understanding danger the way all small things do. 2 men entered the tunnel mouth, carrying lanterns of their own. I recognized their silhouettes. Pike's wardens! They moved slowly, sweeping their lights across the rock face and timbers. Boss said to check for tampering, one of them muttered. Waste of time. Tunnel's been dead for years. Yeah, well. Boss don't pay us to have opinions. They came within 20 feet of where we stood. I held my breath, one hand pressed over Duke's cage to muffle any sound. The warden's lantern light played across the brass plate, but they didn't see it. They weren't looking for details. Just broad evidence of disturbance. After what felt like an hour, but was probably 5 minutes, they turned back toward the entrance. Nothing here. Let's get coffee. Their footsteps faded. Their lanterns disappeared. Silas and I waited another 10 minutes in the dark before we risked relighting our own lanterns. Pike's watching, I said quietly. Constantly. Silas touched the brass plate, which had gone still again. We need to finish this. But we can't do it during daylight, not with wardens patrolling. Then we come back tonight. Miss Calder, Ruth, this is dangerous. Pike has money and wardens and lawyers. If he catches us, I'll tell him I'm mapping. And you'll tell him you're surveying structural damage as the property owner. Which is true. I latched Duke's cage. But we need to know what's behind that steel door before Pike gets a court order to seal this tunnel. Because whatever's inside, he's afraid of it. Silas studied me in the lantern light. Why do you care? I thought about how to answer that. About my father, who died mapping mountain passes for a railroad that paid him in scrip instead of coin. About the ledgers I'd seen at the telegraph office, full of names and wages that never quite added up. About the way men like Pike built empires on paperwork while other men broke their backs in stone. Because I'm tired of watching thieves win, I said finally. Silas nodded once, decisive. Then we'll need the full whistle code. The complete pattern. Can you get the old train schedules? Reverend Bell keeps archives at the Hillside Chapel. He collects everything, timetables, obituaries, wage notices. If the pattern exists, he'll have it. Good. And we'll need help decoding the rivet cipher completely. Those chalk marks were made by someone who knew what they were doing. I might know who that someone is. Reverend Isaiah Bell kept his archives in the chapel's back room, which smelled of paper, wood polish, and the soap he used to clean the printing press every Friday. He was a small man with ink-stained fingers who loved records more than sermons and made no apology for it. Train schedules from '94. He pulled a leather-bound volume from a shelf. I have the complete Cold Spring timetables, including the spur lines. Why? I debated how much to tell him. But Reverend Bell was the kind of man who'd spent 40 years collecting the names of people nobody else bothered to remember. If anyone would understand why a locked tunnel mattered, it was him, because someone hid something in that collapsed tunnel. And I think the train whistle pattern is the key to finding it. Bell's eyes brightened. Evidence of wrongdoing? Possibly. He set the volume on his work table and opened it carefully. The pages were covered in handwritten schedules, departure times, whistle codes for different stops and conditions. He ran his finger down a column marked Cold Spring Spur Morning Run. Here, the dawn freight used a specific pattern. 3 short blasts approaching the tunnel, 5 long blasts when clear, 2 short blasts acknowledging the switchman. He looked up. That's an unusual sequence. Most lines used simpler codes, unless someone designed it deliberately. As a lock, Bell considered this. Who would build such a thing? That's what we're trying to find out. He copied the full whistle pattern onto a fresh sheet of paper, his handwriting precise as a surveyor's notes. You'll need help, Ruth. Whatever you found, Pike won't let you keep it without a fight. I know. Then take this as well. He pulled a small printing block from a drawer. If you find documents, ledgers, contracts, anything official, bring them here. I can print copies faster than you could hand copy them. And I can distribute them before Pike's lawyers bury the originals. I took the block, feeling the weight of his trust. Thank you. Thank me by being careful. Pike's broken men for less than this. From the chapel I walked down Front Street to the sign shop. The window display showed painted advertisements for feed stores and mining equipment, all executed in perfect lettering. A small brass bell chimed when I opened the door. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maylin emerged from the back room, wiping red paint from her hands with a cloth. She was small and precise, with grey threading through her black hair and eyes that missed nothing. When she saw me, she smiled slightly. "Miss Calder, do you need a sign? I need to ask you about the Cold Spring Tunnel. The rivets in the arch. The pattern." Her smile vanished. For a moment I thought she'd deny knowing anything. Then she locked the shop door, pulled down the shade, and gestured for me to follow her to the back room. The walls were covered with stencils and pattern guides. Maylin pulled a folded paper from a drawer and spread it on her work table. It was a detailed drawing of rivet patterns, dozens of variations, each annotated in Chinese characters and English numbers. "I cut decorative rivets for the railroad in 93 and 94, she said quietly. "The cooperative hired me. They wanted patterns that looked ornamental, but encoded information. Payment schedules, names, how much they were owed." "The cooperative?" "Black men, Irish, Chinese, Ute, anyone Pike's mine bosses wouldn't hire or pay fair. They worked the spur line tunnel as independent contractors. Built it better than any railroad crew because they knew Pike would try to cheat them. So they built in proof." She pointed to her diagram. 3 warm rivets, 5 cold, 2 warm. "That's not random. That's a number sequence hidden in metal. The rivet spacing encodes amounts. The chalk marks show which rivets to read." I pulled out my notebook and compared her drawing to my own sketches. They matched perfectly. "What happened to the cooperative?" I asked, though I thought I already knew. Maylin's jaw tightened. "Pike staged a safety blast. Claimed the tunnel was unstable. Collapsed it with the crew inside. Most got out, but by the time they dug through the rubble, Pike had seized the salvage rights and voided their contracts. Said they'd abandoned the work. And the ones who survived? Scattered. Pike made sure they couldn't work in the territory again. Blacklisted them with every railroad, every mine. Some left Colorado, some—" She didn't finish. "Some are still here," I said. She looked at me sharply. "There's a man upriver. Works a water wheel. Keeps to himself. I've seen him at the telegraph office once or twice. Hens that no machinery. Jonah Price," Maylin whispered. "He survived. But he won't talk. Pike made sure of that. He might talk if he knew someone was finally listening." I spent the rest of the afternoon walking, first to Tamsin's boarding house, where I returned Duke and borrowed a mule, a lockpick set that had belonged to Tamsin's late husband, and a canteen of strong coffee. Then up the ridge to the water wheel, where Jonah Price lived in a cabin that might have been invisible if you weren't looking for it. He answered the door with a rifle. "Mr. Price, my name is Ruth Calder. I'm a telegraph operator. I'm here about the Cold Spring Tunnel, and I'm here because I think you were cheated." He didn't lower the rifle. "I don't talk about the tunnel." "Then just listen. Silas Reed bought the tunnel at tax auction yesterday. We found a brass signal plate and a coded lock. We found rivet patterns that Maylin says encode payment records. And we found evidence that Pike staged the collapse." Jonah's expression didn't change, but his grip on the rifle loosened slightly. "If we open that tunnel," I continued, "and if there are records inside, and if those records prove what happened, would you testify? Testify and end up in a ravine like the others who tried. Testify with a federal claims agent and a town full of witnesses. Pike's kingdom is built on silence. Break the silence, and the kingdom falls." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he lowered the rifle and stepped back from the door. "Come in, Miss Calder. We have a lot to discuss." By the time I walked back down the ridge at sunset, I had Jonah's sworn statement in my satchel, a tuning fork that would help us verify the acoustic lock, and the beginning of something that felt like an army, small, determined, armed, with paper and pattern and the stubborn refusal to let theft hide behind fine print. When I met Silas at the tunnel mouth that evening, I handed him the complete whistle code and Maylin's cipher key. "Tonight," I said, "we open the door, and then we see what Pike's afraid of." Silas studied the papers in the lamplight, then looked at me. "You know there's no going back after this." "Good," I said. I never wanted to go back anyway. We waited until full dark, when even Pike's wardens preferred the warmth of the saloon to the cold watch outside a dead tunnel. Silas brought his tool satchel and a coil of rope. I brought Duke my notebook, and Reverend Bell's cyanotype apparatus, a wooden frame and light-sensitive paper that would let us photograph documents using nothing but moonlight and chemistry. The tunnel swallowed us whole. 50 feet in, the brass plate gleamed in our lantern light. Silas pulled out the whistle and played the complete sequence we'd pieced together from Bell's archives and Malin's cipher. 3 short, 5 long, 2 short, pause. Then the pattern again, but inverted. 2 short, 5 long, 3 short. The concentric rings rotated with a grinding sound that made my teeth ache. One by one they unlocked. And then, with a pneumatic hiss that meant seals breaking, the steel door swung inward. Duke fluttered hard in his cage. "Gas!" I said sharply. Silas grabbed my arm, pulling me back. We waited, watching Duke. The canary's wings beat frantically for 10 seconds, then settled. He chirped once, tentative. "Dissipating," Silas said. "But there's a pocket. We need ventilation." He stepped through the door, lantern raised. I followed, Duke's cage held high. The refugee chamber was small, maybe 15 feet square, but engineered with the kind of care that spoke of men who understood survival. Wooden benches lined 2 walls. A hand press sat bolted to the floor, next to stacks of paper wrapped in oiled cloth. Copper pipes ran along the ceiling, connecting to valves that Silas examined with the intensity of a man reading scripture. "Air circulation system," he said, opening a valve. "They built this as a sanctuary, somewhere the crew could seal themselves if Pike tried to trap them." "They knew," I whispered. "They knew he'd come for them." Along the far wall stood a series of metal lockers. I opened the first one and had to steady myself against the cold iron. Inside, journals bound in leather, their pages covered in different hands, ledgers with columns of names, dates, and amounts, payroll chits signed and witnessed, and a hand-drawn map bearing a seal I'd never seen before, interlocking tools forming a circle with the words "Cold Spring Cooperative, 1894" printed beneath. Silas. He crossed to me and went very still. Then carefully, as if handling something sacred, he lifted out the top ledger and opened it. The first page listed names. Jonah Price, May Lynn, 24 others. Beside each name, the hours worked and wages owed. At the bottom of the page, a total 4,147. The next page showed what Pike had actually paid, $0. Reason given, contract voided due to abandonment. Silas turned pages, his jaw tightening. Every sheet told the same story. Work performed, payment promised, debt created. Then in Pike's own handwriting, claim forfeit. Salvage seized per territorial statute 14-7. "This is systematic theft," Silas said quietly. "Documented, calculated theft." I pulled out Bell's cyanotype frame. Then we document the documentation. We worked quickly, laying each crucial page in the frame and exposing it to lantern light filtered through the chemical paper. The process was slow. Each exposure took minutes, but it would create copies that couldn't be dismissed as forgeries. The paper itself would prove the age and authenticity. Duke chirped urgently. We both looked up. From somewhere deeper in the tunnel came a sound like sliding rock. Then silence. "Someone's here," I said. Silas moved to the chamber door and listened. "The entrance. They've triggered something at the entrance. We had maybe 20 ledger pages photographed. There were 50 more. I made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. Take the originals. All of them. Load your satchel. Ruth, if Pike's men catch us, if they catch us with nothing, they'll seal this chamber and burn everything inside. If they catch us with evidence, we have leverage." I kept working the cyanotype frame, hands steady despite the fear making my heart hammer. "We're past the point of caution, Silas. We're into the part where we run." He loaded the journals, ledgers, and chits into his satchel while I finished the photographs. The last page I exposed was the map with the cooperative seal. In the chemical paper's pale blueprint, it looked like something sacred being born. Another sound echoed from outside. Voices, multiple voices. "Now," Silas said. We sealed the valves, closed the lockers, and stepped back through the steel door. Silas tried to lock it behind us, but the mechanism had frozen open. The chamber would be visible to anyone who came this far. "They'll know we were here," I said. "Let them know. We have what matters." We moved toward the tunnel mouth, lanterns shuttered to almost nothing. 50 feet from the entrance, we saw the glow of other lights. Pike's wardens spread across the opening. 4 of them, maybe 5. "Back," Silas whispered. We retreated into the tunnel's throat. There had to be another way out. The ventilation system meant airflow, which meant vents to the surface. I pulled out Mei Lin's rivet map and studied it by the tiny light of Silas's shaded lantern. "Here," I said, pointing to a notation in the margin. "Airshaft, 70 feet west of the main chamber." We found it in the dark, more by feel than sight, a vertical shaft barely 3 feet across, with iron rungs set into the rock. Duke went up first in his cage, then me, then Silas with both satchels. The climb was 30 feet of cold stone and scraped knuckles. At the top, a grate opened onto brush and night sky. We emerged 100 yards from the tunnel mouth, hidden by scrub and shadow. Below, we could see lanterns moving inside the tunnel. Pike's men discovering the open chamber, the missing documents, the evidence of our passage. "They'll come for us now," Silas said. "Good," I replied, surprised by how calm I sounded. "Let them come in daylight, in town, where people can see. We're done hiding." Jonah Price's cabin smelled of machine oil and coffee. He cleared space on his work table, pushing aside gears and springs, and studied the ledgers we'd brought with the focus of a man examining his own grave. "I remember every name on these pages," he said finally. "Samuel Brooks. He had a daughter who wanted to be a teacher. Thomas Chen, best hand with dynamite I ever saw. Mary pitched tent. She could read stone better than any surveyor." He looked up at me. "They're all gone now. Left Colorado or died trying to stay. Your name is here too," I said gently. "With 387 owed, $387 for 4 months of work that broke my back and nearly killed me. Pike paid me nothing and called me a thief when I asked for wages." Jonah picked up a tuning fork from his tool rack and struck it against the table. The tone rang clear and true. "You want to know about the tunnel? I'll tell you." He led us outside to a granite outcrop and struck the tuning fork again, pressing it to the rock. The stone hummed. "Everything has a resonance frequency," he said. "Rock metal air. The tunnel's acoustic lock works because granite at that elevation resonates at specific intervals. The whistle code isn't random. It matches the natural frequency of the mountain itself. That's why the brass plate responds to sound instead of a key." Malin understood patterns. I understood sound. Together, we built something Pike couldn't easily break. "Can you detect other sounds?" I asked. "Things that shouldn't be there." "Like what?" "Like drill holes, placed recently, facing inward, where a blast would collapse the chamber instead of opening it." Jonah went very still. "You think Pike's planning to destroy the evidence?" "I think he can't. Let that chamber exist with us, knowing what's inside." He struck the tuning fork again and pressed it to different points on the outcrop, listening to the way vibrations traveled through stone. "False echoes," he said. "That's what you listen for. When rock's been compromised, drilled or fractured, the resonance changes. Sounds muddy instead of clear. He taught me the difference. Solid stone rang true. Hollow stone absorbed and deflected. Fractured stone created harmonics that shouldn't exist. By the time the sun rose, I could hear the wrongness in rock the way I could spot a bad cipher in telegraph code." "I'll testify," Jonah said, as we prepared to leave. "But only if you can protect the families. The ones still here. Pike will come for them the moment he knows I've talked. Tamsin's organizing that now. Food, shelter, money, people are contributing." "People." Jonah looked skeptical. "You'd be surprised how many folks in Cold Spring are tired of Pike's kingdom. They've just been waiting for someone to light the first match." By afternoon, Tamsin had converted her boarding house dining room into something between a fortress and a war council. Families who'd been on Pike's scrip system sat at long tables, eating real food, bought with real coin that Reverend Bell had collected from shopkeepers who'd quietly waited years for this moment. Deputy Alma Serrano stood in the corner, watching everything with the careful neutrality of someone trying to decide which side of history to stand on. I approached her directly. "You've been following me for 2 days." Following, protecting. The line gets blurry. Alma's hand rested on her holster, but her voice was level. "I need to see what you found in that tunnel." I handed her one of the cyanotype pages. She studied it in the window light, her expression hardening. "This is evidence of fraud. Wage theft, potentially manslaughter if anyone died in that stage collapse. It's also evidence that Pike controls half the county through systematic crime, which makes him either untouchable or vulnerable, depending on whether the law works." Alma looked at me sharply. "You're asking which I am. I'm asking which you choose to be." She folded the cyanotype and handed it back. "There's a federal claims agent, Marshal Otis Bram. He handles territorial disputes when local law is compromised. If you could get these documents to him, originals, not just copies, he'd have jurisdiction to investigate. Where is he?" "Denver, 3 days by train if you leave tonight. Pike will know the moment I board." "Yes," Alma said. "Which is why I'll be the one carrying the documents, in a sealed federal pouch. Is an officer of the county delivering evidence to a superior court?" I studied her face, looking for the lie. "Found none. Why help us?" "Because my brother died in Pike's mine." "Accident," they said. "But the safety inspector's report was written before the collapse happened." She straightened. "Get me everything you have. Ledgers, statements, maps. I'll take the night train." Reverend Bell's printing press clacked through the night like a mechanical heartbeat. Maylin stood at the type tray, setting letters with the precision of a woman who'd spent years making words matter. I read copy, checking names and figures against the original ledgers. Silas operated the press itself, his engineer's hands steady on the lever. We printed 500 broadsides. Each one listed the members of the Cold Spring Cooperative, the wages they were owed, and the statute Pike had twisted to void their claims. At the bottom, in bold type, records recovered. Justice pending, federal investigation underway. By dawn, those broadsides appeared on every door in town, nailed to posts, slipped under thresholds, left on countertops and bar rails. The town woke up to see its theft made public. Pike's response was swift and surgical. By noon, he'd called in credit lines at every business that accepted scrip, cut off accounts at the company store, sent word through his lawyers that anyone who aided the agitators would find themselves liable for damages. Tamsin's boarding house lost its line of credit at the coal yard. May, Lynn's sign shop lost its lease, which Pike's holding company owned. Reverend Bell received a citation for operating an unlicensed press. But something had shifted, something Pike hadn't accounted for. People started paying each other in real money instead of scrip. Shopkeepers extended credit based on handshakes instead of Pike's paper. The butcher gave Tamsin a side of beef on account of old friendship. The coalman delivered 2 tons and told Pike's accountant to come collect. The debt yourself if you've got the spine. The kingdom was cracking. At the depot I met Alma in the early evening. She wore her deputy's coat and carried a leather satchel that contained everything. Original ledgers, Jonah's sworn statement, the cyanotype duplicates, Silas's engineering brief on the staged collapse, and Maylin's explanation of the cipher. "The night train leaves at 9, she said. "I'll be on it. Bram will have the full case in his hands by Saturday morning. Pike will try to stop you. Pike can try." But even as she said it, I saw the line of riders assembling on the ridge above the depot. 6 men, Pike's wardens, positioned where they could watch everyone who approached the station. Silas saw them too. "They're not going to let that train leave." "Then we make sure they can't stop it," I said. The high wooden trestle sat 2 miles east of Cold Spring, where the narrow-gauge line crossed a ravine on a bridge of timber and faith. It was the only way in or out by rail. And at sunset, Pike's wardens formed a line across the tracks. Word had spread fast. By the time Alma, Silas, and I arrived with the evidence pouch, half the town had followed. Wagons blocked the road behind the wardens. Miners and shopkeepers and boarding house widows stood in the dust with whatever they'd grabbed. Tools, lanterns, determination. Tamsin O'Rourke sat on her wagon seat with Duke's cage beside her and a cast-iron skillet in her lap. "Try moving us," she called to the wardens. "I dare you." The lead warden was a man named Garrett, the same lawyer who'd stopped bidding at the tunnel auction. He sat his horse with the confidence of someone who'd always won through paperwork. "Deputy Serrano," he called. "That pouch you're carrying is county property. I have an injunction requiring you to surrender it for inspection." Alma pulled a folded document from her coat. "Then I have a federal transfer order signed by Judge Morrison. My jurisdiction supersedes yours. Stand aside." "The judge is in Pike's pocket," Garrett said. "Then you're admitting the order's a fraud, which makes this obstruction of federal authority." "Your choice, Garrett." The train whistle sounded in the distance. 3 short blasts, 5 long, 2 short, the old tunnel code still in use. The engine approached from the west, its headlamp cutting the dusk. Garrett's hand moved toward his holster. Jonah Price stepped out of the crowd, tuning fork in hand. He struck it against the trestle beam and held it there. The entire structure began to hum. The horses shied. The warden's line wavered. "Harmonics," Jonah called. "This trestle's old. Vibrations can shake loose every bolt if you push the right frequency. I built half the bridges in this territory. I know exactly which notes make them sing." Mei Lin appeared on the opposite side of the trestle with a bullseye lantern, flashing a pattern. The train engineer saw it and pulled the brake, slowing but not stopping. He'd wait for the signal to proceed. I made a decision that felt like falling. The trestle had an inspection catwalk running beneath the main span. I grabbed a rope from Tamsin's wagon and climbed down. "Ruth, no," Silas shouted, but I was already moving, hand over hand along the catwalk toward the center of the span. If I could cross underneath and signal the engineer from the eastern side, the train could approach from that direction instead, bypassing Garrett's blockade entirely. The wood creaked under my weight. The ravine yawned below, dark and hungry. I didn't look down. Behind me, I heard Alma's voice carrying across the trestle. "Federal authority says this train goes through. Anyone who interferes answers to a marshal, not a banker." Garrett's response was lost in the sudden commotion. One of his wardens, nervous or stupid, knocked his lantern into a tar bucket some rail crew had left on the platform. "Fire caught," Duke shrieked in his cage. Tamsin grabbed him and ran. The flames spread fast, licking up the bridge support. Silas and Jonah ran for the water barrels stored at the track approach, but the fire had momentum now. Smoke poured across the trestle. I reached the eastern side and climbed up, coughing. The engineer saw me and leaned out his window. "Bridge is clear from this side," I shouted. "Come through now before it burns." He reversed course, backing the train up and switching to the eastern approach. The locomotive's bulk pushed through the smoke. Alma ran alongside and threw the evidence pouch through an open window. "Denver," she shouted. "Marshal Bram." The train rolled past, picking up speed, carrying 5 pounds of paper that weighed more than Pike's entire empire. Garrett watched it go, his face white with fury or fear or both. Silas and Jonah got the fire out before it took the whole trestle down. One support beam was charred black, but the structure held. Alma turned to Garrett. "That warden who knocked the lamp." "Reckless endangerment. Attempted destruction of county property. I'm taking him in. On whose authority?" "Mine," Alma said flatly. "I'm still a deputy." "And you just watched me do my job." The crowd parted as Alma arrested the warden and led him away. The rest of Pike's men scattered like birds, suddenly unsure whether their employer's money was worth a federal charge. I stood on the trestle, watching the train's lantern recede into the blue distance. Silas climbed up beside me. "It's not over," he said quietly. "No," I agreed. "Now Pike has nothing to lose. Which means he'll try to destroy everything we found." "The chamber," I nodded. "We need to go back, tonight, before he buries it completely." Nettie Kincaid felt the wrongness first. She was 12 years old and deaf, which meant she read the world through vibrations most people never noticed. Tamsin had brought her along despite my protests, but now I understood why. Nettie stood at the tunnel mouth, with one hand pressed flat against the granite, her face gone still with concentration. Then she turned and signed rapidly to Tamsin, who translated, "Hollow wrong. Something buried that shouldn't be." It was near midnight. We'd assembled quickly after the trestle standoff. Silas, Jonah, May Lynn, Tamsin, Nettie, and me. Elmer had stayed in town to keep Pike's remaining wardens occupied with paperwork and the arrested man's processing. We had maybe an hour before Pike realized where we'd gone, or less. "Show us," I said to Nettie. She led us 70 feet into the tunnel, past the brass plate, past the refuge chamber door, to a section of wall that looked identical to everything around it. But when Nettie pressed her palm to the rock, I saw what she meant. The stone here felt different. Dead. Muffled. Jonah struck his tuning fork and held it to the wall. The tone came back muddy, fractured. "Drilled," he said. "Recently. Charges placed behind false-facing stones." Silas ran his hands along the seam. "Facing can be removed. If we're careful. And if we're not?" Tamsin asked. "We learn whether Pike's fuses are on timers or triggers." We worked in near darkness, shading our lanterns to nothing while Silas and Jonah pried away the false stones. Behind them, 4 sticks of dynamite wired together with fuses running back toward the tunnel mouth. "Cut or trace?" Silas asked. "Trace," Jonah said. "If there's a backup trigger, cutting might set it off." They followed the fuses while I stayed with Nettie, May Lynn, and Tamsin. Duke sat in his cage on a timber bench, preening his feathers with the calm of a creature who'd survived worse than this. But I watched him carefully. Duke's panic had saved us before. Footsteps echoed from the tunnel mouth. Not the careful tread of our allies. Heavy boots. Multiple men. And one set of footsteps I'd learned to recognize by their measured, unhurried rhythm. Ephraim Pike. Miss Calder. His voice carried through the dark, urbane as ever. "I admire your persistence, truly, but this has gone far enough." I picked up Duke's cage and stepped into the lamplight near the brass plate. Behind me, I heard Silas and Jonah working frantically on the fuses. Maylin had already pulled out chalk and was marking rapid symbols on the stone, warning codes for Alma if she arrived. Pike emerged from the shadows with 2 wardens flanking him. He wore a fine coat and carried that silver-topped walking stick, as if this were a social call instead of a confrontation in a tunnel he'd tried to destroy. "You've sent evidence to a federal marshal," Pike said. "Impressive. But paper without context is just paper, and context requires witnesses, living witnesses." He tapped his walking stick against the rock. "This tunnel has claimed lives before. Cave-ins happen. Tragic, but hardly suspicious when people go where they shouldn't. You staged the first collapse," I said, keeping my voice level. "You defrauded the cooperative of $4,847 in wages. You falsified safety reports. You built an empire on theft and called it business. I built an empire on understanding how the world actually works. The weak lose. The strong consolidate. The law protects whoever can afford to write it." He smiled. "Your marshal will find that Colorado's territorial courts are quite sympathetic to established interests. Then I'll make sure the newspapers aren't." Pike's smile thinned. "You'll be dead." Duke suddenly fluttered in his cage. "Not panicked. Warning. Gas," I said. Pike's eyes narrowed. "Observant to the end." "Yes, Miss Calder. A slow leak from the ventilation system. This tunnel will be your tomb, just as I intended for the cooperative. History repeating itself feels appropriately poetic." Behind him I saw movement. Elma emerging from the darkness with her service revolver drawn, and a crowd of townspeople armed with lanterns and mining picks. "Ephraim Pike," Alma called. "You're under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and destruction of evidence." Pike turned slowly. "Deputy Serrano, I believe you're out of your jurisdiction here. This is private property, federal property as of 2 hours ago. Judge Morrison signed a provisional seizure order pending Marshal Bram's investigation. This tunnel and everything in it is now evidence in a federal case. Morrison is on my payroll." "Was," Alma corrected. Past tense. "He found religion about 10 minutes after I explained how aiding a criminal enterprise works under territorial law. Pike's hand tightened on his walking stick. For the first time I saw his composure crack. "You're all fools. The system doesn't change because you found some ledgers. It changes when the people who run it decide to let it change. And I decide nothing changes." "You're not listening," I said. "It already has." Silas and Jonah emerged from the side passage, carrying cut fuses. "Disarmed," Silas said. "All 4 charges, and we found your backup timer. Crude work. You should have hired better saboteurs." Pike's wardens looked at each other, then at Alma's gun, then at the crowd of townspeople blocking the exit. They stepped away from Pike, not far. "But enough. This isn't over," Pike said. "Yes," I replied. "It is. Let me tell you why. Because tomorrow, Reverend Bell will print the full accounting. Every name, every amount. And I'm going to stand in the town square and read them all aloud. Jonah Price, $387. Maylin, $214. Samuel Brooks, Thomas Chen, Mary Pitchtent, every single person you tried to erase." I took a step closer. "You thought theft through paperwork wasn't theft at all. But paper remembers. And now everyone will know what you are." Pike stared at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the tunnel mouth, his wardens trailing behind. Alma let him go, but followed at a careful distance. "He'll run," she said, "or try something desperate." "Let him try," Tamsin said, Duke's cage in her hands. "The whole territory knows now. We left the tunnel as dawn broke, the mountain air cold and clean." Nettie walked beside me, and I showed her my notebook, where I'd drawn her name with a small star beside it. She smiled and signed, "The mountain spoke." I listened. "You saved us," I signed back, my fingers clumsy but comprehensible. She shook her head and pointed to all of us. "We saved us." The federal train arrived on Thursday morning with a full complement of deputy marshals and one very irritated U.S. marshal named Otis Bram. He was a thin man with grey, mutton chops and eyes like a hanging judge. He'd spent 20 years as a railroad lawyer before switching sides, and he approached evidence with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved paperwork. We assembled at the tunnel mouth. Everyone who'd fought, stolen, printed, or testified. The townspeople came too, filling the slope with bodies and witness. Bram stood on a flat boulder and read from the warrants in his hand. His voice carried like he'd practiced in courtrooms. "Ephraim Pike, you are charged with 17 counts of wage theft, 8 counts of fraud, 3 counts of falsifying safety documents, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of destruction of federal evidence." He looked up. "That's just what I can prove from 3 days of review. I expect the list will grow." Pike stood flanked by 2 federal deputies, his hands shackled. He'd tried to board a stage to Denver the previous night. Alma had stopped him at the county line. "I demand legal representation," Pike said. "You'll get it at your arraignment." "In federal court," Bram gestured to his deputies. "Take him to the territorial prison. Hold him without bond, without bond." "I'm a respected businessman. You're an indicted criminal," Bram said flatly. "The court can weigh your respectability after we inventory how many people you've destroyed." Pike's eyes swept the crowd, looking for allies. Found none. Even his remaining wardens had quietly melted away, suddenly unwilling to work for a man facing federal prison. As the deputies led Pike toward the prison wagon, something in me loosened. Not triumph, not quite, but something like the feeling you get when a long-held breath finally releases. Bram turned to me. "Miss Calder, I've read your documentation. The cyanotype process was clever, and your editorial summary was the clearest brief I've seen outside a law school." He pulled out the original ledgers, wrapped now in canvas and sealed with federal stamps. "These will be held as evidence. But I'm ordering copies made for the Territorial Archive and for each family named. They should have proof of what they're owed. Owed and paid," I said. "Pike's assets. Seized, auctioned, proceeds distributed to creditors per the wage ledger entries. It'll take months to process, but territorial statute is clear. Fraudulently obtained property reverts to the defrauded parties." Jonah Price stepped forward. "That means the families get their money and their property if Pike seized it through coerced debt." Yes, Mr. Price. The court will make them whole. Bram consulted his papers. In fact, Mr. Price, I'll need your testimony in writing. You survived the stage collapse. Your engineering expertise proves the sabotage. You're a crucial witness. Jonah looked at me, then at Mei Lin, then at the crowd of townspeople who'd stood together on the trestle. I'll testify. But I'm not the only witness. This whole town knows what happened. What's been happening for years. Then this whole town will help me dismantle it, Bram said. Reverend Bell pushed through the crowd, carrying a leather-bound book. Marshal Bram, I've compiled a full accounting. Births, deaths, wage claims, property transfers, cross-referenced with the cooperative's ledgers. If the court needs historical context, it's all here. Bram took the book like it was made of gold. Reverend, you've just made my job considerably easier. The marshal spent the next hour taking statements, recording names, documenting claims. The process was methodical and slow, but I watched people's faces change as they spoke. Shame giving way to anger giving way to something that looked like hope. When the statements were finished, Bram turned to me again. Miss Calder, I understand you have a list. Names from the original cooperative. People who were never paid. I pulled out my notebook. The pages were worn now, edges soft from handling. I'd copied every name from the ledgers, checked them against Bell's records, verified each amount. 43 names, I said. Some deceased, some moved away. But their families are here. Their claims are valid. Read them, Bram said. Let the record show who we're making whole. I opened the notebook. My hands didn't shake. They'd shaken plenty over the past week. But now they were steady as surveyor's tools. Jonah Price, $387. Here, Jonah said. Mei Lin, $214. Here, Mei Lin called. Her voice clear. Samuel Brooks, $462. A woman stepped forward, gray-haired and work-worn. My father. I'm here for him. I read every name, every amount. And after each one, someone answered. Sometimes a surviving worker, sometimes a widow. Sometimes a son or daughter standing in for the dead. The roll call took 20 minutes. By the end, I could barely see the notebook through my tears, but I didn't need to. I'd memorized every name. When I finished, the hillside was silent, except for the wind through the pines. Then Tamsin started clapping. Slowly at first, then building. The whole crowd joined in, applause echoing off the mountain like thunder. Bram waited until the sound faded. The court will honor these claims. Justice delayed but not denied. He closed his folder. This tunnel will be sealed under federal protection. The refuge chamber will be preserved as a historical site. The cooperative's names will be recorded in the territorial register. They built something worth remembering. We'll make sure it's remembered. Alma stepped forward. Marshal, I'd like to request assignment to the investigation. Pike's operations extended across 3 counties. We'll need local knowledge to untangle it all. Granted. You're deputized as a federal investigator, effective immediately. Bram almost smiled. I suspect you'll find plenty of work. As the crowd began to disperse, Silas found me standing at the tunnel mouth. I was crying, which embarrassed me until I realized he was crying too. We did it, he said quietly. They did it, I corrected. The cooperative. Years ago, we just made sure people finally heard. What happens now? I looked at the tunnel, at the mountain, at the town spreading below us in the morning light. Now we map what comes next. 6 weeks later, the first restitution checks arrived. I watched from the telegraph office as families collected envelopes from the land office. Some opened them immediately, hands shaking. Others held them like they were afraid the paper might dissolve. $300. $400, enough to pay debts, buy property, start over. The town changed in small ways that added up to something larger. The company store closed when no one would accept scrip anymore. Pike's Bank building became a territorial courthouse. The saloon that had only served the right sort started letting anyone through the door who could pay in coin. Tamsin hired 4 of the cooperative widows to work in her boarding house kitchen. Mei Lin opened a new sign shop in a building she bought outright, cash in hand. Jonah took on apprentices, teaching young mechanics the mathematics of sound and structure. Deputy Alma Serrano, now Investigator Serrano, spent her days tracking down the rest of Pike's network. She worked from an office in the old chapel, surrounded by Reverend Bell's archives. They made an odd pair, the taciturn investigator and the gregarious record keeper. But they were thorough. One by one, Pike's associates found themselves facing federal audits. Pike himself awaited trial in the territorial prison. His lawyers filed motions. The court denied them. Justice moved slowly, but it moved. On a Saturday in late April, the families of the Cold Spring Cooperative gathered at the tunnel mouth for a memorial. Someone had commissioned a brass plaque, and Mei Lin had engraved it with the cooperative's seal and the names of everyone who'd worked the tunnel. Reverend Bell said a few words. Jonah tuned the air pipe so it sang when the wind blew from the east, a low, mournful note that sounded like the mountain remembering. I stood beside Silas, who'd spent the past month surveying a new rail line that would bypass the old tunnel entirely. A safer route, properly engineered with fair wages for the crews building it. I could use a partner, he said, not looking at me. Someone who understands contours and distances. Someone who can read what the land's trying to say. A map-making partnership? Equal shares. Equal say. Your name on the company registration alongside mine. Now he did look at me. If you want it, I thought about my father who died mapping passes for a railroad that never paid him what he was owed. About the years I'd spent watching theft hide behind fine print. About the tunnel full of names that almost got buried forever. I want it, I said. But I keep the telegraph job too. Someone needs to watch what gets sent over the wires. Keep track of the next Ephraim Pike before he gets started. Silas smiled. Deal! We shook hands formally, which made Tamsin laugh. You two are ridiculous, she said. Just kiss already, Tamsin. But Silas was already leaning in, and I was already meeting him halfway. And the kiss tasted like stone dust and possibility. When we broke apart, Nettie was signing frantically to Tamsin, who translated, She says the mountain approves, and she wants to know if she can be your apprentice. She's good with vibrations. Tell her yes, I said, signing it simultaneously. Tell her we need someone who can hear what others miss. The gathering lasted through sunset. Food appeared. Real food, bought with real money that people had earned and been paid. Duke held court on his perch, accepting offerings of seed and basking in the attention. He'd earned retirement, Tamsin declared. No more gas detection duty. Just sunny windowsills and adoration. As the light faded and people began walking back to town, I slipped away to the tunnel mouth one last time. The brass plate gleamed dully in the evening light. The refuge chamber door stood sealed behind federal locks. The plaque shone new and bright above the entrance. I stepped inside just a few feet and pulled a loose stone from the debris pile. The same test I'd done that first day, when I was just curious about why Pike's lawyer had stopped bidding. I tossed the stone into the dark. It clattered once, twice, 3 times. And then the echo came back, true, clear, perfect. The tunnel had been healed. The mountain had been heard. The names had been read aloud and answered. I pulled out my notebook, half empty now because some injustices had finally found a court, and made a small mark. Not an observation this time. A closing note, Cold Spring Tunnel, justice served. More work to do, because there would always be more work. More pikes, more theft disguised as business. More names that needed recording and reading aloud. But tonight, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like the map-making made sense. Like the distances I measured and the contours I traced were building towards something worth the effort. I pocketed the notebook and walked back into the evening, where Silas waited with Duke's empty cage in one hand and surveying equipment in the other, ready to start the new survey. He asked. Ready? I said. We walked down the mountain together as the stars came out and Cold Spring lit its lamps below us. Behind us, the tunnel exhaled one last breath of cool air. Not a warning this time, but something that sounded almost like relief. The mountain had kept its secrets long enough. Now it could rest, and we could begin mapping the world we'd fought for. The world where treasure was measured in names and justice, not gold. The world where records mattered as much as muscle. The world where a telegraph operator and a blacklisted surveyor could stand together on solid ground and say, "We counted. We mattered. We won." The echo had answered true, and that was enough. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.